The cold, mechanical hum of the broadcast signal filled the silence. Lena Vine stood in the center of a stark, metallic chamber, the harsh lights above casting sharp shadows across her face. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, the rough ropes biting into her skin, but she did not flinch. Her eyes, dark with defiance, scanned the towering figure of the Grand Sovereign, Zechariah, sitting in his regal seat, an imposing figure surrounded by an aura of supreme authority. Today, Zechariah's voice boomed across the chamber, we mark the final end of humanity's insurrection. A rebellion that was destined to fail from the very beginning. He paused, his gaze cold and unyielding. Lena Vine, the symbol of their so-called resistance, will be executed today, and with her, all hope for your pathetic race. Lena didn't respond, though every part of her wanted to scream. Instead, she stood tall, meeting his gaze with a quiet strength that sent a shiver down the spines of the imperial officials present. They expected her to beg. They thought she would break, but she was not like them. Not like the cowering creatures that had once believed themselves to be her people. She was human, and she would die with the fire of her people still burning in her chest. Around her, the room buzzed with an eerie, almost clinical anticipation. The audience, million strong, watched from across the galaxy as their screens flickered to life, broadcasting the spectacle. The Empire knew the power of a public execution. It was their tool to crush rebellion, to instill fear, and to remind all who watched of their place in the universe. Lena was just another prisoner to be disposed of. Just another casualty in their war of domination. But they did not understand. Lena's breath came slow and steady, the weight of the chains no more oppressive than the weight of her resolve. She had been in this situation before, when the first shots of the rebellion had been fired. Her family, her homeworld, gone. It had been the Empire that destroyed them. And yet, here she stood, not as a broken woman, but as the final, defiant flame of hope. If her death could bring the universe together, then it would be worth it. Zechariah's eyes narrowed. He could sense it, the quiet defiance that refused to bend, to break. You truly believe you are a hero, don't you? He said, his voice laced with contempt. A martyr for your kind's pitiful rebellion? You are nothing. A speck in the grand design of the galaxy. Lena's lips curled into a faint smile. You're wrong, she said, her voice carrying through the chamber. You think you've won. But you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. Her voice, though soft, was clear. This is not the end. It's just the beginning. Zechariah leaned forward in his chair, his fingers tapping on the armrest. He could feel the eyes of his officials on him, the whispers behind him. But he would not allow himself to be swayed. Lena's words were nothing but the final remnants of a dying cause. Your words mean nothing. You die today, and your resistance dies with you. Lena's gaze never left him. You think you can kill an idea? You think you can kill hope? We've already won. You're just too blind to see it. Her eyes flickered to the large screen behind Zechariah, where the broadcast was being projected live to the galaxy. What happens next will make you regret every moment you've spent trying to break us. The tension in the room escalated, the silence thick enough to suffocate. The ceremonial blade, glinting in the harsh light, was brought forward. The executioner, faceless and emotionless, stood to the side, awaiting the signal. Zechariah's lips curled into a smile, his eyes flashing with a cruel satisfaction. Enough talk, he said coldly. Let her see the consequences of her defiance. He gave a subtle nod to the executioner, and the cold steel of the blade hovered just above Lena's neck. But Lena, in those final moments, felt only clarity. She had known this day would come. She had known that one way or another, the Empire would try to break her. But they had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated her. The executioner's hand trembled as he raised the blade higher, his eyes darting nervously between the Grand Sovereign and Lena. The tension was unbearable, the hum of the broadcast the only sound in the chamber. Then, the cold metal flashed downward. But before it could strike, Lena's voice cut through the air like a knife. Do it, she whispered, her tone cold but filled with unwavering resolve. And you'll see the galaxy burn. For the briefest moment, Zechariah hesitated, his confidence faltering. But it was only a moment. His eyes flashed, and he nodded once more. The blade came down. Lena's body went limp, but her eyes remained open, unyielding. As the screen flickered to life, showing the grim image of her lifeless form, the broadcast went silent. The Empire had done its worst. They had executed their enemy in front of millions, but in their arrogance, they had failed to understand the power of a single human's defiance. Across the galaxy, in rebel bases hidden on distant worlds, a new fire sparked in the hearts of those who had been waiting, watching, and hoping. Lena Vine had become more than a martyr. She had become the symbol of humanity's last stand, a symbol of their unbreakable will. And within 27 minutes, something began to shift. The Empire, for all its might, had made a grave mistake. Humanity had been wronged, and now they were waking up. The silence after Lena's death hung heavy in the air. Across the galaxy, there was no celebration, no cheers of triumph from the Empire. Instead, a quiet sense of unease settled in. The broadcast had ended, but the damage it had inflicted was far from over. In the dimly lit corridors of a rebel outpost on the fringe of the galaxy, a figure stood before a wall, staring at a series of holographic images. Lena's face, burned into the memory of every human watching, flashed on the screens. Her last words echoed in the minds of those who had heard them. "It's not over. It will never be over." Jace Kellen, a former soldier-turned-resistance leader, clenched his fists. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the image of Lena. The room was filled with a low murmur of voices, a chorus of quiet anger and fear, but none dared speak. None dared voice the doubt that lingered in the air. Jace wasn't sure whether Lena's death would spark what they all hoped for. But one thing was certain: her sacrifice had done something to the people. It had given them the strength to rise. "They executed her like an animal, Jace." The voice came from behind him. It was Ira, one of his closest allies and a fierce fighter in the rebellion. Her words were sharp, her anger barely contained. "She was humanity's last hope, and they took her away from us." Jace turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "And now we take it back," he said, his voice low but steady. "Her death wasn't the end. It's the beginning." Ira looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something: reassurance, hope, perhaps even certainty. "You really believe that? After everything that's happened? The Empire controls half the galaxy. What can we do against that?" Jace took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "We can start a fire. One spark can set everything ablaze." The room fell into silence again. Each person present, fighters and supporters alike, knew the weight of his words. But they also knew the risks. They had seen the brutal power of the Empire firsthand, felt its crushing force. Could one person's death truly ignite a revolution? The silence was broken by a voice over the comms, soft but resolute. "We've got something to show you," came the voice of Mace, another leader in the rebellion. He was stationed on one of the many hidden ships that now flitted between the stars, evading Imperial patrols. "We've intercepted transmissions from a few of the Empire's military bases." Jace's eyes flickered with interest. "What do you have, Mace?" "Evidence," Mace's voice responded. "That they've already started moving resources away from their strongholds. Something's brewing, and it's not just the normal suppression." The rebels gathered around the central table where a hologram flickered to life. The images it projected were of Imperial ships, massive and imposing, moving in patterns that suggested something far beyond a simple response to rebellion. This wasn't a crackdown, it was preparation. "Looks like the Empire's planning something big," Ira muttered, leaning in closer. "What does this mean?" Jace narrowed his eyes, studying the data. "They're preparing for something they think we'll do," he said, his voice measured. "The more they tighten their grip, the more people will slip through their fingers." Another figure, Cora, a former Imperial officer who had defected years ago, stepped forward. "The Empire's making a mistake," she said. "They think crushing a symbol like Lena will stop us." What they don't understand is that they've made her immortal. Every time they try to shut us down, every time they think they've won, they'll be reminded of her. Jace nodded. Exactly. She's their biggest mistake. The room began to hum with a quiet intensity. The initial shock of Lena's death was fading, replaced by the realization that they were not powerless. The rebellion had been fractured, scattered across countless systems. But now there was something unifying them, a shared fire, a sense of purpose. The message from Lena was simple but profound: it's not over. Over the next few hours, Jace and his team worked relentlessly, coordinating with other factions of the rebellion scattered across the galaxy. News of Lena's death had spread far and wide, but now there was something more. Rebel cells, previously hesitant and isolated, began to unite under her banner. Human colonies that had been silent, oppressed for so long, were rising up. As the hours passed, Jace found himself in the heart of the command center, surrounded by a handful of his most trusted officers. The comms were alive with the voices of rebels reporting in, sharing information, planning their next moves. It was clear now, the rebellion had grown beyond anything they had imagined. "We're ready," Jace said, his voice firm and decisive. "We've gathered enough support. Now it's time to hit back." Ira stood beside him, her eyes sharp. "Where do we strike first?" "Everywhere," Jace said, his tone filled with conviction. "We send a message to the Empire that we are not done. We strike at their supply lines, hit their communication centers. We make them bleed." The team around him nodded in agreement. They had lost so much already. People, planets, entire systems. But Lena's sacrifice had sparked something deeper, a desire for vengeance, yes, but also for justice. For freedom. As the days passed, the rebellion grew more coordinated. Ships were dispatched, attacks launched, and sabotage became routine. But even as the Empire countered with brutal force, the resistance was no longer a scattered handful. It was a galaxy-wide movement, a force to be reckoned with. Back on the imperial capital of Noxium, Zechariah could feel the shift. His intelligence reports were coming in faster than he could read them, and they all pointed to one thing: the rebels were no longer disorganized. They were becoming a serious threat. A threat fueled by something that could not be crushed by force. Hope. He scowled as he surveyed the reports, his fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest of his throne. The news of Lena's death had been broadcast across the galaxy, and yet the backlash was worse than he had anticipated. It seemed as if every corner of the galaxy was now rallying against him. "Send word to the fleet," Zechariah growled. "We will destroy them all. I want every rebel cell eradicated." But even as he spoke, his words carried a certain edge of doubt. For the first time in his reign, he wondered if his empire was truly as invincible as he had believed. Back in the rebel camp, Jace stood by the comms, his eyes scanning the latest updates. He didn't speak, but in his heart, he knew one thing for certain: Lena's death had ignited something that could not be extinguished. And now, it was their turn to rise. The tension in the rebel base was palpable, like an electric current running through the air. Jace Kellen paced in front of a large holographic map, his fingers brushing against the cool surface as he watched the glowing blue markers representing Imperial strongholds flicker in and out of focus. The rebellion had been growing, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. "Are we ready for this?" Ira's voice was sharp, her eyes narrowed with a mixture of anticipation and doubt. She stood across the table from Jace, arms crossed, her fingers tapping rhythmically against her sleeve. Jace didn't answer immediately. His gaze shifted over to the communication console, where Mace's face appeared, weathered but resolute. "We've gathered intel," Mace said, his voice steady despite the faint crackle of static. "The Empire's military is overstretched. They're scrambling to secure their supply lines, and their communications are in disarray." "Good," Jace responded, his voice low but filled with resolve. "It's time to make them pay for thinking they could crush us with one swift strike." The room fell silent. The rebellion had spent months in the shadows, watching, gathering information. Lena's death had sparked something in every corner of the galaxy, And now, finally, the rebellion was ready to move in force. There was a gnawing urgency to it. The Empire had underestimated humanity, and now they had to be shown the price of their mistake. Where do we hit first? Ira asked, her voice betraying a trace of anxiety. She had been with Jace since the earliest days of the rebellion, and every decision they made carried a weight, a responsibility to the thousands of lives at stake. Jace's finger tapped on a specific point on the map, an Imperial supply station on the outskirts of a remote system. We hit them where it hurts, he said, his tone clear. Cut their access to weapons, to troops, to fuel. If we cripple their supply lines, they'll be forced to divert resources, spread themselves thinner. Mace nodded in agreement. We've got a fleet ready for the strike. It'll be a swift, surgical hit. Take the station, and get out before they can retaliate. The plan was simple, but no less dangerous for its simplicity. The supply station was heavily guarded, and any misstep would expose them to the Empire's wrath. But the rebellion had grown tired of hiding. They had seen what had happened when they cowered in the shadows. Lena's death was the catalyst, but it had ignited something more, a burning need for retribution. Everyone's in position, Jace said. We go in at 0 hour. The rebel ships left their hidden bases with stealth, moving through the dark reaches of space, the stars their only witnesses. The silence of the journey felt surreal. There were no words, no speeches, only the hum of engines as they approached their target. Inside the cockpit of his own ship, Jace felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle in his chest. The adrenaline was beginning to build, but he kept his emotions in check. Ira sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the tactical display. Are you ready for this? She asked, her voice quieter now, a hint of concern beneath the confidence she tried to project. I've been ready for a long time, Jace said, his voice a low murmur. This is what we've been waiting for. We can't afford to fail. The station loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of metallic structures and vast landing platforms. From a distance, it seemed impenetrable, a fortress in the void. But the rebellion had one advantage: speed and surprise. The Empire never saw them coming. The first wave of ships launched their attack, sending shockwaves through the station's defenses. Blasts of energy ripped through the air, lighting up the void as rebel fighters clashed with Imperial forces. The battle was fierce, but the rebels fought with the ferocity of those who had nothing left to lose. Every shot fired, every explosion that rocked the station, was a message. They were no longer the hunted. They were the hunters. We've taken the outer defenses. Mace's voice crackled through the calms. Engaging the main structure now. It's going down fast. Jace felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the harsh reality of war. Keep pushing, he commanded, his hands steady on the controls. Don't give them a chance to regroup. Inside the station, chaos reigned. Rebel forces stormed the halls, overpowering Imperial soldiers at every turn. Explosions reverberated through the walls, sending debris raining down as the fight moved from corridor to corridor. The rebels knew they had only minutes before reinforcements would arrive. They had to act quickly. Jace and Ira led a squad into the heart of the station, where the main control room was located. The corridors were narrow, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning metal. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, but it was too late for the Empire to stop them. The rebels had breached the heart of their operation. We've got to shut this down before they can send a distress signal, Ira said, her voice steady despite the tension. She approached the control panel, her fingers dancing over the keys. I'm almost there. Suddenly, alarms blared, a high-pitched wail filling the air. The Empire was on the move. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. Jace turned to Ira, his eyes meeting hers. You're doing great. Just a few more seconds. With a final press of a button, the control panel flickered, then died. The station's systems went dark, and with it, the Empire's ability to retaliate. The rebels had succeeded in their mission. The supply station was no longer a threat. Mission accomplished, Ira said, her voice tinged with triumph. But Jace knew this was just the beginning. The Empire would respond, of course. They always did. But what they didn't understand was that every attack, every blow they struck, only made the rebellion stronger. The Empire had killed one symbol. But in doing so, they had created thousands more. The rebels regrouped quickly, making their way back to their ships. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. As the ships shot off into the void, Jace's heart raced, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense that they were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for victory. Back on the Imperial capital, Zechariah's eyes darkened as he watched the reports flood in. The loss of the supply station was just the beginning. A wave of insurgency was spreading across the galaxy, faster than he could contain it. He clenched his fists, his thoughts turning inward. "This is only a temporary setback," he muttered to himself. "We will crush them all. Every last one of them." But deep down, even Zechariah knew something had changed. Lena's death had sparked the fire, and now, the galaxy was burning. The rebellion had begun. And the Empire would never be the same. The silence was deafening as Jace stared out the viewport of the rebel ship. Beyond the glass, the stars stretched out in infinite silence, a cruel reminder of how small they were in this vast galaxy. But it wasn't the stars that filled his thoughts. It was the firestorm coming their way. "Jace!" Ira's voice interrupted his reverie. She stood beside him, her eyes intense, scanning the data streaming across the console. "We just got a report from our scouts. Imperial reinforcements are on the move. They're coming for us, and they're bringing everything they've got." Jace didn't flinch. He had expected this. The Empire didn't take defeat lightly, especially not after what they had just lost. "How long until they arrive?" "About 2 hours," Ira answered, tapping a few commands into the console. "They've mobilized their entire fleet. This won't be a simple strike." Jace turned from the viewport, his mind already racing. Their small victory at the Imperial supply station had sent ripples across the galaxy. But now, they would face the full force of the Empire. The rebellion had no illusions. They couldn't win a war against the Empire with just one victory. This was only the beginning of what would be a long, bloody struggle. "We have to move fast," Jace said, his voice firm. "Prepare the fighters. We need to hit them before they reach the system. The longer we wait, the more time they have to call in reinforcements." Ira nodded, her lips pressed in a tight line. She was no stranger to the cost of war, but the stakes had just grown higher. The Empire wouldn't stop until they had wiped out every last trace of the rebellion. This would be a battle for survival, plain and simple. The rebel fleet was ready. A ragtag group of ships, old and new, formed a loose formation as they jumped from hyperspace. Jace's ship, the Aurora, led the charge, flanked by a dozen smaller fighters and cargo vessels. Despite their numerical disadvantage, the rebels had one advantage: speed. They knew the Empire's tactics too well. "We'll hit them at the edge of their fleet's formation," Jace ordered, his voice steady over the comms. "Surprise is our only advantage here." "Understood," came the replies, a chorus of resolve over the comms. They were ready. But Jace knew that readiness wouldn't make up for the difference in firepower. The Empire's fleet emerged from hyperspace in a coordinated wave, their massive capital ships dwarfing the rebel vessels. The cold, imposing might of the Imperial Navy was a sight to behold, sleek, armored, and deadly. But the rebels didn't flinch. Their mission wasn't to destroy the Empire's fleet, it was to slow them down, to buy time for the rest of the resistance to mobilize. "Engage!" Jace commanded, his hand gripping the controls with a calm intensity. The Aurora surged forward, its weapons flaring to life. The battle had begun. Rebel ships darted through space, striking at the edges of the Imperial fleet. The enemy ships were slow to react at first, not expecting such a bold assault so far from the main conflict. The rebels' hit-and-run tactics proved effective for a time, but they couldn't match the sheer firepower of the Empire. "Jace, we've got incoming!" Ira's voice crackled through the comms. "TIE fighters, lots of them. Take them down," Jace ordered without hesitation. "We can't afford to let them get past us." The sky erupted into chaos as swarms of TIE fighters descended on the rebels. For a moment, the fighters were everywhere, darting, diving, weaving between the ships, unleashing a deadly barrage. The rebel pilots fought back with a vengeance, their ships moving with deadly precision. Ira's voice cut through the static as she took down another fighter. "One more, Jace!" Ira shouted, her excitement barely contained. "We've got this." But just as the momentum shifted in their favor, the tide turned. Imperial dreadnoughts loomed on the horizon, their massive cannons swiveling, unleashing torrents of firepower on the rebel ships. A rebel fighter exploded in a fiery ball of flame. Another ship was hit, its hull cracking under the barrage. The rebels were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. "Reinforcements are here." Mace's voice came through the comms, but there was no joy in his tone. "They've got us outgunned." Jace's heart raced. He could feel the pressure mounting. The Empire wasn't just here to stop them, they were here to wipe them out. The rebels were outmatched, and they knew it. They had only one choice left. "Pull back!" Jace shouted. "We've done enough. Get out of here!" But it was already too late. The Empire's trap had been sprung. Rebel ships were caught in a vice, surrounded by Imperial forces that were too numerous and too powerful to resist. The rebels fought back, but they were overwhelmed. A blast rocked the Aurora, throwing Jace forward into the console. The ship shuddered violently as alarms blared across the bridge. "Shields are down," Ira called out, urgency in her voice. "We've got to get out of here. Now." Jace gritted his teeth, slamming his hands on the controls. "Jump to hyperspace. Now!" The stars streaked by in a blur as the Aurora leapt into hyperspace, narrowly escaping the Imperial onslaught. The fleet scattered, each ship jumping to different coordinates, trying to evade the Empire's wrath. As the ship settled into the eerie calm of hyperspace, Jace leaned back in his seat, breathing heavily. His mind raced with the aftermath of the battle. They had fought hard, but the Empire had struck back with terrifying force. "We lost a lot today," Ira said quietly, her voice distant. She stood beside him, looking out into the depths of space. "Too many." Jace didn't answer right away. The words were there, but they seemed meaningless in the face of the carnage. "We lost more than just ships," he said finally. "We lost people." The comms crackled to life, Mace's voice coming through again, heavier now. "We've got wounded, Jace. Some of them, they're not going to make it. But we've got a message to send. The Empire may have hit us hard, but they haven't broken us." Jace closed his eyes, the weight of responsibility settling in his chest. The rebellion was taking casualties, but it was far from over. As long as they fought, there was hope. "We regroup," Jace said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We keep fighting. We don't stop until we make them understand, this war isn't over. Not by a long shot." The Aurora plunged deeper into hyperspace, and the battle, though lost, had left a mark, one that would burn in the Empire's memory for a long time to come. The stars outside the Aurora flickered as Jace Kellen gazed out the viewport, a deep, unsettling silence filling the space around him. He had seen the rebellion grow from a whisper in the shadows to a full-fledged war, but the cost of it had been heavy. The battle at the Imperial stronghold had left scars, on the fleet, on the people. And yet, even in the aftermath of their losses, there was something else in the air. Something undeniable. They were on the cusp of something bigger. "Jace!" Ira's voice broke through the tension, drawing his attention back to the task at hand. She stood at the command console, her face marked by fatigue but also a hardened determination. "We've got word from Mace. The Empire is starting to crack." Jace turned, his brow furrowing. "Crack? What are you talking about?" Ira's lips curled into a grim smile. "The first signs of disarray. Their fleets are stretched too thin, their supply lines are damaged, and their leadership is scrambling. We've made them bleed, Jace. And now, they're starting to realize we're not going away." Jace nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on him. They were winning, slowly but surely. The rebellion had gained ground, yes, but the Empire wasn't finished. Not yet. And as long as Zechariah, the Grand Sovereign, ruled with iron-fisted control, the war would continue. But there was something different now. The tipping point had arrived. The rebel fleet had gathered on the outskirts of the Empire's core systems, where they had been picking off Imperial installations one by one. Jace had chosen this moment to strike. The Empire, though still formidable, was faltering. Their response time was slower, their tactics more reactive than proactive. It was the perfect time to hit them where it would hurt the most. "How soon until the fleet arrives?" Jace asked, his voice steady but urgent. The plan was risky, but it was the only chance they had. "We're ready," Mace replied through the comms, his voice gruff but unwavering. "We've got a fleet of our own, more than we've ever had before. They're going to feel this one." Jace clenched his jaw. "Then let's make it count." The Aurora led the charge, flanked by a dozen other rebel ships. As they approached the Imperial capital planet of Noxium, the heart of the Empire, Jace's heart beat faster. This wasn't just another strike. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the one that could change everything. "All ships are in position," Ira said, glancing at the tactical display. "They're not expecting us here. This could be the final blow." "We don't stop," Jace said, his voice hard with resolve. "We take everything they've got. We cripple them before they can regroup." The rebel ships charged into the atmosphere of Noxium, moving with ruthless precision. The Imperial defenses were formidable, but they weren't ready for the scale of this assault. Rebel fighters and bombers tore through the sky, engaging Imperial forces in an all-out aerial battle. The ground trembled as rebel forces pushed deeper into the planet's defenses. "Prepare for ground assault," Jace ordered. "We'll hit the heart of their operations, Zechariah's palace. If we take that, we take everything." Ira gave him a sharp look, her gaze questioning. "You're sure about this? If we breach that palace, there'll be no going back." Jace's eyes hardened. "It's the only way to end this. We have to make him pay for everything." The palace, a towering structure of dark metal and cold steel, loomed ahead. Imperial forces poured out from every crevice, but the rebels were unstoppable. As they stormed the gates, Jace felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the feeling of fighting for something greater than himself. He was no longer just a soldier, he was a symbol of hope for every world the Empire had oppressed. "Push forward!" Jace shouted, rallying the troops. "For Lena! For humanity!" The rebels surged forward, blasting through walls and sweeping aside the Empire's forces with precision. Each step brought them closer to their goal, Zechariah. The walls of the palace were lined with guards, but they fell one by one as the rebels advanced. Finally, they reached the inner sanctum of the palace, Zechariah's throne room. The large doors, adorned with symbols of the Empire, were thrown open. The sight that greeted them was as chilling as it was grand. Zechariah, standing tall in his regal attire, looked every bit the tyrant he had become. His cold eyes met Jace's as the rebels entered, a sneer curling on his lips. "So, the rebels think they've won." Zechariah's voice rang out, rich with disdain. "You've come far, Kellen, but you're too late. You can destroy my palace, my fleets, but you will never defeat the Empire. I am the Empire." Jace didn't flinch. His voice was unwavering. "You were the one who underestimated us. You thought you could break us, but you've only made us stronger. Today it ends." Zechariah's eyes narrowed. "You think you can topple centuries of power with a handful of rebels?" He took a step forward, his voice dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I will burn every last one of you to ash." Jace stepped forward, his blaster raised. "No, Zechariah. You're the one who's already burned." In a blur of motion, the first shot rang out, echoing through the hall. Zechariah staggered, his face contorting in shock, as a bolt from Jace's weapon struck him. The once untouchable sovereign fell to the floor, his reign collapsing in an instant. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the flames that had started to consume parts of the palace. Zechariah's guards, caught off guard by the sudden attack, hesitated before they raised their weapons, but they were no match for the rebels who had been fighting for too long. Jace stood over the fallen emperor, his chest heaving with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. The battle wasn't over, but the head of the empire had been severed. The next few days were a blur. Rebel forces moved swiftly to secure Noxium, bringing down the last remnants of Imperial command. Across the galaxy, the news of Zechariah's death spread like wildfire. Systems that had lived under the Empire's rule for centuries rose up, casting off their chains. The galaxy was in chaos, but it was a chaos the rebels knew they could control. Jace stood on the balcony of the palace, staring out over the capital. Ira approached quietly, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. "We did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jace didn't turn to face her. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the first light of a new dawn was breaking. "We did more than that," he said softly. "We showed them that they could never keep us down. We showed them that no empire is invincible." He paused, the weight of the moment settling over him. "This is only the beginning." And as the galaxy began to rebuild, one thing was certain: the Empire had fallen, but humanity had risen.